All right, it's time for the news update. We're here with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm doing all right, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I got a new Nirvana shirt. That's pretty cool.
Very nice.
I like it. But you have a new story that's even better. This one comes out of the federal courts out of Texas and deals with 18 to 20-year-olds, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, as you said, a judge in the Northern District of Texas, a federal court judge, just struck down the portion of Texas's gun carry law that limits adults who can carry being 21 and older. Basically said there's no historical tradition in this country of limiting the rights of young adults to bear arms, and put an injunction on the state of Texas from enforcing that provision of the law. So that's a pretty big deal, especially because Texas is a permitless carry state. So extending the rights of permitless carry to 18 to 20-year-olds is definitely a big ruling.
Yeah, and this was this is from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas. Judge Mark Pittman. He wrote, based on the Second Amendment's text as informed by founding era history and tradition, the court concludes that the Second Amendment protects against this prohibition. Texas's statutory scheme must therefore be enjoined to the extent that law-abiding 18 to 20-year-olds are prohibited from applying for a license to carry a handgun. So this requires that Texas accept applications to carry for anyone who's an adult, basically.
Right.
And so that's a pretty big ruling. It's one of the first post-Bruen rulings, of course. We've had a couple now, and you're starting to see the impact. Although I will say, just as an aside, we also got a ruling about the President Biden's ghost gun kit ban rule that went into effect this week. And a federal judge in that case upheld the ability of the ATF to redefine what a firearm is, and didn't necessarily do a full analysis of the history, but effectively said that there is a longstanding tradition of regulating commercial sale of firearms in the United States. And so we had sort of dueling rulings.
That's right.
This week. But this one, I think, is a bit more significant because it's in line with what we're seeing on the front of young adults or adults under 21. And there have been a couple of cases that dealt with the gun rights of that group. You wrote about a couple of these in your piece. What were some of the other ones?
Yeah. So last year, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a federal appeals court, struck down basically a prohibition on people 18 to 20-year-old from being able to purchase handguns, which is a federal law. And it struck that down, so that's unconstitutional. And this predates Bruen, as you pointed out. And earlier this year, another ruling that predates Bruen out of the Ninth Circuit, a 3-judge panel for the Ninth Circuit said that California's ban on under 21-year-olds purchasing semi-automatic centerfire rifles is how they defined it, essentially.
Yeah.
AR-15s
Right, what California calls assault weapons.
Right.
In California, they had a ban on anyone 18 to 20 being able to purchase those guns.
Right. And the judge struck that down and said that was unconstitutional. So, yeah, as you pointed out, it's kind of a trend that we're starting to see in the federal court system where judges are starting to find that there's really no rationale, or at least in their opinion, there's no rationale for restricting Second Amendment rights to this group. There's no history for it. And I think that's only going to be more clear in light of Bruen. And this judge here in the Texas case drew pretty extensively on the history of the American founding. He pointed out to the fact that 18 to 20-year-olds were regularly part of the militia, so therefore carried arms. And there's some interesting citations in there as well. He pointed to military heroes throughout the country's history. If you guys look at the ruling, pointed to people like Audie Murphy, famous World War II hero. But basically to just essentially make the point that, look, young adults have been able to bear arms forever in this country, so there's no reason to necessarily restrict them from doing so now.
Yeah, or at the very least, you can't put a special prohibition on them that isn't applied to everyone. The ruling doesn't come down on the idea that, permitless carry has to be the only way of regulating gun carry. But if you're going to do permitless carry, you can't deny that to 18 to 20-year-olds.
Right.
Because historically they weren't singled out from gun rights protections. And in fact, were, as you just mentioned there, a significant part of the group that won independence in the United States. And
right.
Of course, they remain a significant part of our military today and law enforcement.
That's right.
So.
One thing that kind of tempers the ruling a little bit, though, he did, before enjoining the law, he put a 30-day delay on that order, essentially to give the state of Texas time to consider an appeal. I reached out to the Department of Public Safety, didn't hear back about whether or not they intend to do so. But I think that creates an interesting dynamic where now the government of Texas, which is a very red state, a very pro-gun state, is now put in an awkward position where do they challenge this and try to uphold this restriction, or do they allow the ruling to stand and let 18 to 20-year-olds carry guns going forward?
Yeah. And, that's an especially fraught question in Texas right now, because one of the other interesting things is as the courts have gone towards protecting the Second Amendment rights of 18 to 20-year-olds, public opinion has gone the other way.
Right.
Especially this year when after the events in Buffalo and Uvalde, especially where you had 18-year-olds carrying out these horrific attacks, public opinion has shifted significantly towards either severely restricting the gun rights of that age group, or at least putting further restrictions on them. For instance, the bipartisan gun bill that was passed earlier this year, the federal level adds a new layer of scrutiny for 18 to 20-year-olds when they're going to buy guns. They're effectively put into a sort of de facto waiting period as the law requires a more thorough, or more, I don't know what the right word for this is, but more extensive check that involves actual, instead of databases being queried, you have to call up actual people, which is inevitably going to add time to that check, which is why in practice it feels more like a waiting period. But you've seen support for restricting the sale of AR-15s and other firearms to 18 to 20-year-olds. Florida passed a ban like that after Parkland, where you had another shooter who was in that age group. And so public opinion has shifted towards wanting to restrict the rights of 18 to 20-year-olds, whereas at the same time, the courts have begun to add more protections for their gun rights.
No, I think that's a good point. We'll see how that plays out in the political sphere, because you might see a lot of backlash to these rulings if that's the case. If public opinion keeps moving that way, but judicial decisions keep going the other way, it could create a pretty tense environment, I think, in terms of gun politics.
Of course, that's sort of the point of the courts, right? Is that they're meant to protect people's rights even when it's unpopular. So it is an interesting phenomenon to see as the general public is less willing to protect the rights of this age group, while the courts have become more willing to do it. But you're right. That could obviously lead to some tension down the line. But, you see this my guess is that public opinion is not too favorable towards people who take the Fifth Amendment, for instance, or to Fourth Amendment protections for people that most suspect are doing something illegal. So that's sort of the nature of having these protections in the first place.
Even that free speech these days is pretty unpopular with certain crowds, but courts routinely uphold free speech rights. So that's a good point.
That's what it's not necessarily an unusual thing for the courts to buck public opinion on when it comes to these sorts of protections. But at the same time, there's a relatively new trend in for the federal courts to move in this direction of, saying that, you can't specifically restrict gun rights for these age groups. So if you're going to pass a permitless carry law, you can't say that 18 to 20-year-olds who are otherwise law-abiding can't partake in the same legal protections as anyone over 21.
No, that's right.
So, we'll continue to follow that, of course. I doubt that this will be the last time an 18 to 20-year-old restriction is before the court. And it'll be interesting. You're right. It'll be very interesting to see what Texas does, given their, reputation as a pro-gun state. Are they going to continue to fight this? I think that stay that the judge put on is a fairly common thing. You'll see.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen, but it's pretty common for a judge to stay their ruling to give time for the government to decide on whether it wants to appeal or not when one of its laws is struck down. So
sure.
We'll continue to follow, though. I'm sure you will update us when there is a development in this case.
Absolutely.
But